Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this very special session with Forrest Kim and Quint Studer. We're going to focus today on one particular criterion: competency development from assessment to action, strategies to meet criteria III.C.2. And criteria III.C.2 is a really important criteria within CAHME. It's looking at competency assessment. What we'll do on the agenda today is first, we'll take a look at Forrest Kim will examine some of his experiences with competency assessment and taking a look at some of the challenges around that, and then specifically looking at the OSAR tool and how that's kind of what he's seen, how that's helped him go through the competency assessment process. Quint will come in next and take a look at the OSAR approach. How was it developed? Well, how is it used in its industry? What are some of the success stories for the tool? And then he'll talk about some of the key guiding principles, how the tool was developed, how it's implemented, how it really is effective. And then finally, we'll go back to Forrest, where we'll take a look at some of the examples of applying the OSAR tool at Baylor. And we'll look at outcomes, skills, actions, and resources. That's the OSAR tool. Let's take a look at III.C.2 and why it's important. III.C.2 is the #1 criterion that's missed by most CAHME programs when they go through their accreditation or reaccreditation. 67%, 2/3 miss it. And the other criterion that's related to it is III.D.2, which how does the program use that data to understand how you make improvements in the program. But III.C.2 looks at how the program evaluates the extent to which each student attains the competencies at the level targeted by the program. Now, we created a process at CAHME called the Reimagining the Accreditation process, which was named by Quint. And Quint, thank you for providing that name to us so many years ago. And what we're really just looking at in there is how do we help programs? How do we define guidelines? How do we provide some guidance so that they know how to meet CAHME's criteria and standards? What we're looking at today in this session is specifically that kind of tool to help you along in this. We want to get that 67.7 down. Two speakers today, Quint Studer, the founder of Healthcare Plus Solutions Group, and Forrest Kim, the executive director and clinical associate professor at Baylor. I've got two really long bios for both of them, but let me just kind of say this. Quint, I think when I think about Quint and the impact he's made, he's a person that is very concerned about data and is very concerned about how you use that data to improve the process. But I think the other underlying part about Quint and what really kind of defines him as a person is how do you make people better? How do you invest in people to get them to the skill set in which they really can succeed? He did that when he was at Baptist Hospital in Pensacola, where was the first winner, the first healthcare winner of the Malcolm Baldrige Award. He did that with the founding of the Studer Group. He did that with the founding of the Studer Community Institute to kind of look at how do we improve communities. He did that with his ball team. He's doing that again with the new organization called Healthcare Plus Solutions Group. And I think, Quint, probably my experience was what you did with Aramark back when I worked for them, where your approach saved lives, and we've seen it save lives. And I think that's, to me, more than this bio and this listing. I think that's my perspective of where your skills are and what you bring to this journey. You're also a board member at CAHME, and let me go from there to Forrest Kim, who's our board chair. Forrest, I think if you were to define Forrest, it's someone who is involved in service. How do you help people get better? How do you help organizations get better? Forrest is also a true believer in data and how to make it actionable. And when I first saw Forrest present what he was doing at Army Baylor, which probably was like 6 or 7 years ago, Forrest. I was totally impressed because the approach of looking at competencies, assessing them, and working with students to help make them better was very routinized in a very strong approach to have students in the program, the Army Baylor program, get better. He's kind of taken that same approach, and he's also applied it at UIW, the University of Incarnate Word, and now at Baylor. He's a fellow in ACHE, and I think has really just done an amazing job at CAHME on our board, kind of leading us through the past year. So with that, let me turn it over to Forrest.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks for those very kind and generous remarks. It is so great to see so many familiar faces. I know with the pandemic, we haven't had the opportunity to really see each other as much as we'd like. So it's great to be able to get on this call and just talk through, I think, one of the issues, as Anthony laid out very well, that's been a challenge, I think, for most programs, which is competency assessment. So I'm going to take a minute just to kind of share a little bit about my competency assessment journey with CAHME and talk through how we got to today. And then really what I'm hoping to do is just talk to the expert, to talk to Quint. And Quint and I are really hopefully going to have a conversation around a tool that he developed that I think is super exciting, that has very strong implications for both our work in healthcare management education as well as the field of health management. So if I can just begin very briefly by talking about the journey that I've been on with competency assessment. You know, there was a transition that was made many years ago at CAHME to move from more of a content-based evaluation and content-based within our graduate programs to more competency-based. And during that transition, I was at Army Baylor at the time, and we really were kind of wrestling with how to assess competencies. And as Anthony mentioned, I think within that framework, we really had individuals that had served as administrators and had kind of that mindset and had a lot of energy. And so we put our minds together, and I just remember being in a room with Brad Beauvais and Paul Brzezinski, and we were talking through how can we quantify the assessment process and make it kind of routinized. And we developed something called the BEAR. I'm going to share something similar to that here as we transition towards the end. But basically, that just captured competencies over time in snapshots of that student's journey as they progress through our program and through their residency. And so that was kind of the beginning of the journey, brought that into when I transitioned to University of Incarnate Word and imported that tool, a similar tool at University of Incarnate Word. And then lastly to Baylor, that tool was adopted at Baylor. But one of the things that I will share is that it has been a challenge. And as Anthony has showed you, the statistics are very clear on that. They're the top two issues that programs struggle with, and that's probably why there's so many people on this call today. But one of the things that I, as I went through this competency journey was that the challenge was there, but what I was finding in that was that there was some value in the assessment process, but the greater value was actually in the conversations that happened because you had that aggregate data. Conversations that you could have at the program level at identifying specific areas that you might have weaknesses in and how to inject additional content and developmental activities at the program level. But more importantly, I believe, was the conversations that were happening really with students and advisors. And this is where I think this tool that we're about to talk to has such great value. I first heard about the OSAR at a talk that Quint gave at Baylor. He's been gracious to come speak to our students, alumni, and stakeholders for 3 years now. And this last time that Quint spoke, he mentioned the tool. One thing that Quint says that I fully believe and I can testify to is that when you've heard Quint speak once, you've heard Quint speak once. Like every time we've heard him, it's been new content that he's introduced. And the last time that he spoke, he introduced this tool called OSAR. And really what it does is it allows you to take data and translate it to what he calls precision leadership development. And so I was super excited when I heard Quint. When he mentioned it in that session, I took notes and I said, every program, health management program in the country needs to hear about this. And after that session, I had a conversation with Anthony. I said, Anthony, this is really neat stuff. And this could really help move the field. And more importantly, what it can do is it can kind of give encouragement and hope to the field in showing how all the work that we've been doing in terms of competency assessment, where the value really can come in to translating to student development. So that was a long introduction, but wanted to give some context. I'd like to, again, welcome Quint. And Quint, thank you so much, first of all, for taking time to do this. And let's have a conversation, if you will, on this great tool.
Well, thank you. And I've been busy scrolling to see who's on and how they're dressed. Len, I like that green shirt you're wearing. Green looks really good on you. It's been fun to be here. And yeah, and just for a couple quick things, I've always, as many of you might know, I was a teacher. I was at a bachelor's and master's in education. I was telling Forrest before we got on, when I first got into healthcare, I felt like I didn't fit because I came from this teaching background. And these were all people that had different degrees. And it wasn't until I realized I have to teach that I became more effective. And what do you teach? You teach leadership, you teach skills, you teach development. So that really changed my career. And the other thing I've been very fortunate on, I served on the AUPHA board for over 6 years. In fact, that book, The Calling, $1 for every book it's bought goes to the AUPHA. And now I'm very fortunate to be on the CAHME board. So I appreciate that. For those of you that wondered, well, how did Forrest get Quint to come to his class? Well, he asked me, just like Auburn asked me the other day. And normally if you let me do it virtually and I can get it scheduled at no charge, I'd love to come to your classroom because it really fills me up to have some type of impact on students. So thank you for the opportunity, Forrest. Where would you like to go from here?
Well, Quint, I'd love if you can just start with talking about the tool itself. So folks are probably really interested in what is this tool? And so if you can kind of just describe it, and then I have another series of questions to ask.
Okay, let me tell you where it came from. One of the things I've realized over the years, and I've done this for workshops forever, is people come to my workshops or I go to their organization. I was just at Cooper University Health last week with 800 people in the room. So I go to these places and I always ask them, just out of curiosity, about their training to become a leader. And then I asked, most of the training was my boss quit and they asked me to be a supervisor and I didn't want to do it. So they named me an interim. Interim is the #1 job title for people entering leadership in healthcare sometimes. And the reality is, when you look at it, normally probably 90% of the people in the room do not have a master's in healthcare administration or do not have a master's in business administration. Doesn't mean that they might have a master, but it's usually in their technical skill. So one of the things I've known, and I think this is really great for your students, is one of the competencies they're going to have is developing talent. No matter how much I know I speak at accounting classes, and I go to accounting classes because the professor wants me to explain to the students accounting they know, it's leadership they've got to learn if they want to move up in their organization. So I think this is where it sort of came from. So to go back, the last couple of years, we've got so many new people in leadership. 25% of people in healthcare leadership are new in the last 3 years. Many of them came through the pandemic, their boss quit, and about another 25% have been promoted from within. So the other day I spoke at Cooper. It was the first time they'd had their group together in 1,185 days. And they made a big deal about that, which was great. But then they realized 43% of the people were not in leadership 1,185 days ago. So we started looking at, like you do, and you're high performers. I will tell you, as Forrest did, high performers take tools that work in other entities or industries, and they figure out how to move them into their own industry. That's a high performer. I've seen it for years and years and years. So what happened was, as we got into this, we started looking at how do you train and develop people? And we know evidence-based medicine sort of birthed evidence-based leadership. So I think precision medicine has to go to precision development. And today, like you do with your students, you know every student's unique. Every student's an N equals 1, just like every patient's an N equal 1. So we have to look at what they do. So before this, we do some assessment with them, like you do with your competency checklist. And I think that's really important because we have something that looks like a competency checklist, but yours is much better, by the way. And it's skills that a leader will need to be successful in their job. And they rank themselves, just like I've looked at Forrest's work. They rank themselves, and then their supervisor ranks them, and then they sit down and they collaboratively have a conversation. Now, the other challenge we found is overwhelmness. People are overwhelmed. So when your graduates are supervising people, they're going to be overwhelmed, particularly people in management. Wow, I'm brand new. All of a sudden, I've never done this before, the whole bit. So the other question we ask is it doable? And I'll get to that later. So we started with TriHealth in Cincinnati, Ohio. They revamped how they train and develop people, and we went to a precision leadership skill process. We've done the same thing at Cooperman Barnabas in New Jersey. In fact, Airmark just outsourced leadership development to my new company to do this. So let me walk through how this came about. So we find clarity is important, and you're all smart. If you study Cotter and the Heath brothers and almost anybody, they talk about clarity. So one of the things we know that a leader wants is clarity. Tell me really what you want me to accomplish. But we also learned if we put too much in there, they can't do it. So what we want to do is make it doable. So this is a real life example. This is an example of a nurse manager in a hospital in New Jersey. And she was promoted during the pandemic, which meant they told her just get people in here. So she had a lot of overtime and a lot of agency. Now, all of a sudden, anybody in healthcare knows everybody's being told by this date, get rid of this much agency, this much agency, this much agency. She never had really scheduled before. So when she filled out her competency checklist, one of the areas that was a weakness or an opportunity was how to schedule. So the skill she wants is scheduling, but we always wanted to bring it back to the outcome. And the outcome, what we're looking at is to achieve her labor budget. And you would probably put a date in here to take it to the next level. And now she needs to be good in development. So what are the actions? Well, we found by looking at studying people, there are certain people in the organization that are very good with scheduling, but they're not going to knock on somebody's door and say, let me help you schedule. I hear you might need help. But we identify what we call these master level people that can be good mentors. And then actually there's a development on how to be a mentor, because we call, let's go from being a mentor, not a tormentor, which can happen in healthcare. And then we put some actions in to meet biweekly with your direct supervisor. And don't be afraid to review that you're struggling with scheduling. And of course, get staff feedback into the situation. And then when we can look at, and again, I can't see it all on my screen because I'm so busy looking at many of you right now. We basically then look at where are the resources. And this is really a fascinating tool that I think we uncovered some interesting things in healthcare with resources. And that is the fact that in the area of resources, what we found is it's not a lack of resources. It's really sometimes overwhelmed with resources. So I'll give you a real life story. In TriHealth, one of the goals they want to do for certain leaders is improve 2 questions on their employee engagement survey. Do I feel that senior leadership is communicating in an open, honest manner? And do I feel comfortable sharing my concerns? Which all ties into trust. And if you are academia, if you look at the latest research, the biggest fall down has been lack of trust in senior executives in healthcare because they got closer to their supervisor and so on. So then we looked at all the tools that they have in their learning management system to help with communication. There were 18 of them. Why? Because when we're not getting the results, we keep throwing more resources. So the other thing we put in is a rotten tomato type score, where when somebody uses a resource, they can go in and evaluate how effective was that resource. And I have a whole bunch of these in front of me because I utilize them, and I'm going over them right now with people. And I'm looking at, okay, what's the outcome here? What's the skill you need? what's the actions you're going to take, and what are the resources. And we have found this is what I call CEOs in healthcare tell me it's a game changer, because most of these executives do have a master's if they're at the VP level, but now they've got to break it down and develop people so it's doable. So this is how it's being used in the industry. And what I really like is when your people walk out of your programs, they're going to be able to do training and development. And that's really one of the things that they're going to, be accountable for. So you want to do the why and the how, Forrest?
Sure, that sounds great. Quint.
And I go real quick. I already talked about it. So many people are new in their role. And I always say that one of the key diagnostics right now is to make sure that you know the newness. Now, you don't need it. You know your students. But if they're out there in the real world, in the healthcare, not in the different real world, in the healthcare world, they're going to have to know it's an experience. When I was speaking at Cooper, I said, how do you like Jalen Hurts? They're by Philly. They like the Eagles. They said, we love Jalen Hurts. I said, why do you like him? Well, because he's good. I said, why is you like him now more than you did 2 years ago? Well, it's because he's got 3 years experience. So we have to look at experience. It's a component of what we call precision leadership development. We want to ensure the actions are doable. And I don't mean doable like they have the skill to do them. They normally do. Do they have the time to do them? Because what we find is people are so overwhelmed. So if you notice this leader on scheduling, that's what we're going to focus on right now. That skill, not HCAPs, not a whole bunch of other things. Just focus on getting scheduling right. Then we can talk about the other thing. I think it really does a nice job saying, are these resources? So for example, I'm talking to Forrest. When he did it, he found they were resource rich in a few areas and not resource rich in a few other areas.
Yep.
I love it because it's a collaborative approach. You're actually developing a collaborative approach to your development and going through it with the person. And then it really helps, like I said, with the resource quantity, quality, and gaps.
Well,
So,
can we talk about some like application guidelines? Like how do you implement? What are some best practices here that you found?
Sure. First, it starts with really looking at what are the skills that this person needs in the job. If you were looking at your set, it'd be what are the competencies you're trying to teach. I think there's so much similarities. So if I'm somebody in the area of lab management, what are the skills I need in lab management to be successful in this organization? So clarity of skills and clarity of outcome. Because if I have the skills, I should get the outcome. And one of the things we find, Forrest, is people can overrate their skill set. We go through this. They take a skill like, let's say, hiring and onboarding. And they said, well, I'm pretty good at that. But we look, 25% of their people aren't staying 90 days. So they're not really good at it. They have a skill, but they're not implementing that skill to the fact that it's effective. So we really want to make sure we clarify what's the outcome of your job and what are the skills you need. Then I think the self-awareness key is the key, because we have to be on the same page. And usually there's and that's a collaboration. Sometimes people say, maybe one of the skills is running an effective meeting. Okay, well, do you or don't you? Let's find out if we do. I think if you look at an employee engagement survey, here's a key example. Latest research shows that leaders feel they're recognizing and rewarding staff, yet staff don't feel they're being rewarded and recognized. So even though you think you have the skill in reward and recognizing, the data on the employee engagement survey shows somehow the people aren't seeing it like you're seeing it. So it's outcome, skill you need, but that's the collaboration. And I think that's the magic. We can't outsource development in the workplace. We have to own it. Everybody's a chief development officer. And then I call it the magic of doable. And the magic of doable is, here's an example. At Cooperman Barnabas, one of the skills was rounding on patients. And then we asked the person, well, how many patients do you have? And she goes, 42. How many are you supposed to round on every day? 42. How many questions are you supposed to ask them? 5. What are the odds of you asking 210 questions today? She goes, it ain't going to happen. And then they want her to put a bunch of stuff on an iPad, which either she's going to fudge the iPad or not do it. So then we said to her, well, that doesn't seem doable. She goes, it isn't. So then we say, what is doable? We came up with the doable is every new admit and one question. And the question is, what's your biggest concern or worry right now? You can see the anxiety go down in people when we've made the learning doable. And then the feedback loop on the resources. So if we tell you to watch this video or use this mentor, when mentors know they're now being evaluated as a mentor, it's a little different, or some resource we have, you get that feedback loop. And not to punish, but we have continuous quality improvement.
This is great. Well, Quint, it's so funny, just a quick kind of aside, when you talk about individuals not being able to kind of appropriately assess where they're at. I know, if I asked the group, for a raise of hand, how many students on their self-assessment rated themselves much higher than they thought that you thought they were? For example, if it's a 10-point scale and a student will do the self-assessment and we've got, 24 competencies and they're 9s and 10s on day one, that there's an issue with the self-awareness. And one of the things that I think is so great when we talk about the assessment tools that these programs, all of us have kind of started implementing, is it really allows you to triangulate upon the truth, like really get multiple perspectives to really land on where you're at. And I think it is so important, like you mentioned, Quint, about the collaborative nature, because it really does take a village in both assessing and developing student competencies. And so I think those points are really well taken.
I think misperception first in healthcare that if I have an HR department and an OD department, they're supposed to be doing this development. They can't. They can just help provide the resources. People have to own. So what this does is really make it clear who's in charge of with that, developing that individual. So I think this collaborative approach has been a real ha-ha for many organizations.
Thank you, Quint. Well, what we'd like to do next is to kind of step through how this tool can be employed within your academic programs. And again, I think it really takes the work that we've done from a competency assessment standpoint. You can use the work you've done, target specific competencies that you want growth in, and then develop an action plan at the student level to really implement this idea that Quint talks about precision leadership development. And I think the precision comes because you have the data. And I think that's why I think the work that we're doing is so important. So I'll take some time just to talk through this. This first slide that you see in front of you is, I think, a great tool for those programs that are starting their competency assessment program. I know that there are several directors and faculty from new CAHME accredited programs and programs that are in candidacy. So I think it really is helpful from the very start is to map out on a single slide, how are you planning on assessing competencies as a student moves through the course of a program? And I think this is a good way to kind of start in that assessment process. And this is just an example that we use, the way that we do it at Baylor. And you can see the different colors represent different types of assessment that are taking place for student competencies. We have self-assessment in the beginning. We've got an objective body of knowledge exam. And then faculty assess the students as they progress through each of the semesters on the competencies themselves. We do have two separate tracks within Baylor's program. We have a track specifically called the preclinical track for students that are actually matriculating into med school or dental school as they leave our program. So it's a one-year healthcare MBA. And so you have the post-assessments that are done at the first year. But our residency track students that go to a residency in that second year, you can see that the competency assessment continues. And the competency assessment transitions from the faculty in the first year to preceptors in the second year. And then you see those assessments that are on the back end. I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but this basically is the way that we track competencies, again, quantitatively as students progress through. So let me quickly orient you to this graphic. On the left-hand side in gray are the competencies domains, and those are the broad, again, domains that the competencies fall under. The next column, that second column, are the 24 competencies that our program says that we are going to develop and assess in our students. And then the next rows, as you progress through this is essentially an Excel spreadsheet, are basically the different touch points where we're actually assessing competencies as students move through the program. And you see the self-assessment, you see faculty assessments as they progress through the fall, spring, and the summer, preceptor assessments at the end of the residency, the final self-assessment, and then we have an oral board, comprehensive oral board for all our students that we assess students at the domain level. On the bottom right, you see the scale, and that scale basically shows you the scale on which we are assessing students. And basically for our students, we want them to achieve basically a 3.5 or a 4 at the end of their experience with us. And that's really what we're targeting for them to get to. One of the things, just as another kind of a funny story, I taught a competency assessment as a part of a panel one year at AUPHA, and we went through these. And one of the things is we called this tool at Baylor the BEAR. I think it's the Baylor Experience and Assessment Report. We called this spreadsheet at UIW the CARD, the Competency Assessment Reporting Dashboard. And then as I gave this talk at UPHA, Tom Haynes was in the room, and he was the program director at Baylor at the time. And the one thing that I left that group with was that if you develop this tool, the only thing that I ask you to do is come up with a really spiffy acronym to describe it. And Tom Haynes calls this the SICM. And that's our what we say at Baylor. So this is a student-focused integrated competency evaluation model. But the biggest thing is I know that programs are struggling really at this place, is how do we get to this point in aggregating the data? But what I really hope to do is with Quint's admonition and with the tool that he's developed is, how can we take this to the next level? And so really, when you look on the right-hand side of this tool, you see in that final self-assessment where the student has identified that they basically are struggling, or they don't feel as confident in certain areas. So the translation is you would identify one or two of those areas. And the way that we do it at Baylor is we ask the students to identify like 1 to 3 of what they believe are their strengths from a competency perspective, and 1 to 3 that they believe are an area for improvement. And again, this is where the OSR, I think, has such great value. And so what I'd like to do next is just to walk through the OSR in health management education. And so as Quint did from an industry's perspective, we can do from an educational perspective as we have the students. And so from an outcome perspective, there are 2 things that in this case we've identified. One would be an area that the student wants to grow in, right? It's a strength and they want to continue in. And one would be an area that they believe is a challenge. So that the area that they feel was a strength was to improve critical thinking skills. And then the area that they felt was a weakness was improving financial skills. And again, all this is possible because we have the data to get to this level of precision. Because again, if we didn't aggregate the data, we would basically be kind of just throwing darts against a dartboard and figuring out if it lands. But because we have the data, we can identify these areas of strengths and weaknesses. And so the outcome, walking through improving, would be to improve critical thinking skills. In this case, the skills themselves ask the question, what skills do you want to master? And in this case, the student in this conversation that we had in a final advising session said that they wanted to improve in structured approaches to thinking. They knew that they were strong in critical thinking, but they wanted to get better. And then the specific actions would be to pursue project management professional certification, or to pursue Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certification. And then lastly, in the resources, for one, obviously it's the Project Management Institute. There are other agencies that are out there, but that's one. And then the second, at Baylor University, we do have the opportunity to train folks on and to receive their Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certification. So those are the 2 steps that the student wanted to pursue. And then this last one would be to improve financial skills. The skill itself, they wanted to improve specifically on the budgeting process. And it was so interesting. So Quint is in the process of doing his OSARs with his faculty. And I just finished our final advising session with our students. And this was a specific example. When I had the conversation with the student, they identified financial skills as a weakness. And in the conversation, I said, so you want to improve in this area. How do you think you could do it? And at this point in time, the student was transitioning from our program back to the location that they had the residency, which in this case was Kaiser Permanente in California. And it was so neat because the student was already thinking about competency development throughout the year. They had, even before they came back for our capstone, had a conversation with the CFO, and already volunteered to help in the budgeting process. And so when I asked the student, how can you improve? They already had the answer, right? I've already had this conversation with the CFO, and I'm going to volunteer to help in build next year's budget. And so again, a very collaborative approach to competency development as they're moving forward in their careers. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute. Quint actually we had a conversation before the call about the translation of this tool from academia into the workplace. And Quint, can you talk about a little bit more about what you see the value in having students being introduced to this tool while they're in an academic program, and then how that translates into the workforce?
Thank you. Nice to see my local university, UWF, on the line, Karen. So nice to see you. Anyway, I'm glad you're going through the certification now. That's exciting. Yeah, Forrest, and just so everybody knows, I've learned so much from being involved with CAHME and so on. So where Forrest showed the competency checklist with all the colors and the numbers, we actually use something very similar. So we'll send that out as part of the tools. It's a tool that looks like it, but it's a little bit different. It'll go through the skills that that leader knows needs to have in order to be accomplished at that goal, whether it's an emergency director, whether it's somebody in accounting, revenue cycle. Talked to Vincent the other day. What are the skills that the person needs for that job? And then they rank themselves. So I love what this is for us, because somebody leaves, let's say, your program and goes into where we're seeing precision leadership development. They've already done this. They've just done it with competencies versus what we call skills. So it's very similar. What I like about this is everyone that leaves a program is not going to inherit a bunch of experienced managers. So this allows them to be a developer. This allows them to get a lot of wins with their leaders that they're supervising. Because what do leaders want? They want clarity. They want prioritization, and they want development. So if you look at this gives me clarity. It also gives me priorities, because what you did for us with this student is prioritize what they want to get better in. They want to get better at improving financial skills. So you gave them the priority. And then the question is, well, the how. So this gives them resources. So when people leave utilizing this tool, they can take this tool right into their leadership role in their organization. And I think probably be considered one of the better mentors and developers in their organization right off the bat. And for those that are developing, they're hitting the 3 key points. Clarity of what you want me to accomplish, the skill I need to accomplish that, and the resources you're going to provide me, which also ties into retention. Because let me give you some statistics if you haven't seen it lately. If you haven't seen it, my company sponsored the biggest study done in years on different care models. And we can send that out. It was presented at ACHE with me and Katie Boston-Leary from the ANA. Let me give you some statistics. Frontline managers, when they were surveyed, 92% of them said they wanted skill development in their organization. And 80-something% of frontline staff said they wanted skill development. Then when they asked, are they getting it? Less than 40% feel they're getting it. This ties into that skill development piece, which ties into retention. So you get the retention bonus and you get the better outcome bonus. Is that, Forrest, what we were talking about?
That's perfect. I wanted to kind of just highlight something that you said earlier, and what you just said now is that, again, students will be exposed to this while they're in their program, so they can continue their competency development journey as they transition into the workforce. But the point that you made about then the student using this as a tool to develop their own people, it's like the student becomes the teacher, right? They learn this tool while they're in the program, but then they can actually use the tool when they have direct reports. And we've got executive healthcare programs that are represented today. And so there's plenty of folks that will transition from being in our programs to middle to senior managers even, and they can quickly kind of employ this tool. So that's another very exciting piece of this.
When you're sitting with someone, Forrest, I think you had this experience with your student with improving financial skills. You can see their anxiety go down. There's just a psychological thing when you sort of make it doable for them. And I'm very excited about this. And I think your students that utilize this can go in their organizations and not only be more effective themselves, but bring resources to the organization. And we'll send you a few more how our competency checklist. I want to explain the OSR TM to you too. We want you to have this for free. So we want you to have everything for free. So you might say, well, Quint, if you want this for free, why are you intellectually protecting it? Because in my past history, I've gotten so excited about giving stuff away. Other people then have protected it, and I've had to buy some things back that I thought I was involved in.
That's great. Well, we've actually gone through kind of our content pretty quickly. I'm going to just make one other comment before we transition to a time of Q&A. So one other point that I want to make for programs as you look through this whole process of the OSR is, CAHME and as accreditor and all accrediting bodies, really the focus is on continuous quality improvement. And so when you think about the resourcing step, I just want to share one quick story. I was going through my final advising sessions with our students, and one of the competencies that the student felt like they wanted to improve in was one of our competencies, which is health policy and policy advocacy. And there are some of these competencies where the resources are very straightforward, right? So we can talk about oral communication. And if I ask for a raise of hand, how many folks have suggested Toastmasters to their student as a resource for improving oral communication? I'm sure I'd see a lot of hands. And I've suggested that as well. I don't know how many of our students have taken us up on that, but it's one of those things where there is a readily available resource that aligns with a competency. But sometimes there are resources that don't. So this example of health policy and advocacy, I was kind of stuck. And I was like, well, you and I should Google. When you get back to your workplace, you should Google health advocacy groups within your respective area and learn how to get involved with them. And so in one sense, it serves as a gap analysis to the resources that we can actually refer our students to. Paula Song and I collaborated on a project over the pandemic where we knew that our students had a lot of extra time on their hands. And so we wanted to add value since they weren't spending as much time in person in the classroom. And so we developed a resourcing list of like certification. And I know that Maureen Jones at University of Kentucky has done this at Penn State when she was there. But that is another way where this becomes a value added in terms of developing an inventory of tools for the resources. I think can be very helpful. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I get to see everyone's faces because I was looking at just Quint's face and Anthony the whole time. But we'd love to just open it up for Q&A to the group and just see if we can answer any questions that folks have.
So Forrest, let me go through the last list of questions I've kind of been put in the chat, and I'll ask them to the two speakers. So the first question is, can you say more about the body of knowledge exam done after the self-assessment at the beginning and end of the program? Was this developed by your faculty, or is it a standardized exam from an external source? And that question comes from Shonda Jones. So can you say more about the body of knowledge exam done after the self-assessment?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Shonda. So that body of knowledge exam is actually developed by our faculty. Because we have a competency model, we use the NCHL competency, a modified version of that with input for our advisory council. And so it's not exactly aligned with the NCHL's competency models. So because of that, we didn't believe that there was a tool that was out there that could fully capture the competencies within our specific model. So we basically broke out to specific content areas and asked our faculty to write 5 questions because we know our content the best. And they wrote those 5 questions. And then, so again, we have our students take that body of knowledge exam in the beginning of our program before they've taken any class and also at the end. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Boris. Eileen Alexander, I kind of commented that she developed an alternative approach called the YUC, the Yearly Update of Competency for Nursing. So Eileen, that's really clever. Forrest, any thoughts on the YUC?
I could only imagine what the mascot is. There just has to be a one-to-one correlation between what you call it and your mascot. That's like my rule for developing an acronym.
The next question was, is there any value of doing the self-competency assessment in the middle of the program? beginning, middle, or end? Or is it close enough to have it only during 2 times? And Forrest, what I'll ask you to do as you kind of respond to this is kind of, you know, certainly how you've done it, but then if you want to kind of briefly talk on the official CAHME kind of approach to it, would probably be good too.
Yeah, I would say that nothing that I'm sharing is basically a prescribed approach to it. It's just what experiences that I've had personally in these 3 different programs. So just to be clear, we're not stating that these have to be done. Even the use of the OSAR tool is not a mandate. These are just ideas, just because folks have wrestled with these issues over time. In answering that specific question, I do believe that there is value at some type of midpoint self-assessment personally. And at Baylor, we've actually incorporated that. It may not be reflected actually in that graph, but that was something that we found would be valuable to have it actually at the beginning of the didactic year. And then from our residency students, do it right before they transition into their residency, to have an assessment of how far they've come along. And then that also can lead to a conversation with the preceptor. And we do encourage that students, and they have to write about it in their first month of report when they're in residency, is how having a conversation around the SICM, around where they're at, so that those that assessment can help inform the projects and rotations they go to into their residency. So I think it's very informative to have that at the middle point, and then again at the end. Great question.
I think
And my legal counsel has me on speed dial, and he asked me to read a statement. So I want to emphasize that this is an approach. This is an approach. This is not the official CAHME approach. There is no official CAHME approach in terms of competency assessment. OSR is one approach. There are others. CAHME does not endorse or recommend any one approach. So with that, let me go to the next question.
Hey, Anthony, can I add one thing with the follow-up of that? Number 2, of course, in the healthcare world, you measure by the outcome. So if you're supposed to roll your labor cost, what are your labor costs? But talk about residency and interns. I own 2 minor baseball teams. I have about 30 sports management interns and residents that we have. And we're using this with our interns and residents. And we find that they like it because it ties into us having a commitment to develop them. And it's a very specific commitment to develop them. So now, I don't know if it works that way, but I know it works in sports management very well.
Question from Ben Tate in Canada. I note that you established the baseline at the start of the program and at the program level rather than within each course, so that there is a course-specific baseline to use for course improvement. Could you speak a little about that decision and what role admissions criteria might play as a proxy for evidencing a baseline understanding of knowledge and of competence?
Wow, that is a big question. You know, one thing that I would just state, and I don't know if I'm going to answer that exactly precisely, but one thing that I will say is that we are intentional about decoupling to a certain extent the course, if you will, assessment with the competency assessment. So I know different programs do it differently. I know at Seton Hall, they have specific rubrics that are tied to questions in courses that align with the competency score. The way that we do it in Baylor, and again, it's not perfect, it's one approach, is we actually have the faculty at the beginning, they will do the competency course crosswalk to identify the competencies that are assigned to that course. And then the faculty member at the end of that course, based on how the student's done overall in that course, will give a subjective score to that student with the competencies that are assigned. And so it's not a one-to-one linkage between, right, a specific deliverable or exam. It's more of a subjective approach that the faculty will use. And again, it's imprecise, but that's the way that we found that we do it at Baylor. So that would be one thing. From an admission standpoint, the one thing that I would say is that you know, we don't have necessarily a criteria from a competency standpoint for our students. One thing that we do know is that our program is more focused on early careerists. So that would be kind of a general guideline. We are not an executive program. And so our understanding is none of our students will be coming into the program with a high level of competency. They will be fairly new. Most of them come with 1 to 2 years of work experience on average. And so there is not necessarily a baseline that we've established for competencies.
How are faculty assessing competency assessment throughout the program? Is this assessment tied to a specific assignment or the assessment? So how does faculty go about assessing competency?
Yeah, I think I noted that. I think that the idea is, again, it's a subjective assignment. And again, we leave it up to the faculty to do this. One of the things that you all, I'm sure, experience is faculty assessing competencies is a transition. It's an evolution, and it's really a transition between how we've graded our students in the past to what we're doing now. So we've given quite a bit of flexibility. Me personally, in the classes that I teach, I will look at certain assignments. And so, for example, if I'm looking at written communication, I'll look at how they've done on an essay that they wrote for the class. And then based on that score, I'll come up with, again, an idea to kind of center on a score that would give them overall. But again, it is not tied to specific assignments for most faculty. I think they will look at the assignments that they've given and then come up with a subjective kind of score on the back end.
Do you have any suggestion for the comp ratings and language to discern the difference between a B+ student and a B- student? Suggestions for a deep and kind conversation with the advisor. So I think, Forrest, there's maybe like 2 questions in here. One of them is, how do you discern that difference? But I think second is, and we've kind of struggled with this, and I appreciate if you address it, but how course grades are different than competency assessment. So if you want to talk.
Yeah, and this is where I think competencies do have a bit, right, more from an action orientation. They have a bit more value. So the example that I give is, when I took statistics in my MHA program at Army Baylor, I got an A, right? So I learned how to study. I kind of met the mail. I did well on the exams. But if you would have asked me to rate myself on statistical analysis from a competency standpoint, I would not rate myself very high, because I knew how to study for that course. And I knew, basically, I practiced enough on those practice exams that I could get an A. But from a practical standpoint, in terms of implementing those statistical skills towards a real life application scenario, I knew I wouldn't be that good. And so I think in some cases, I think there is more of a direct connection between the assignment and the competency, and others, there's a disconnect. And I think our challenge as educators is really trying to align that assessment to the real world application. Because at the end of the day, we don't want just book smart students, right? We want students, and that's the whole reason why we moved to competency development, is we want students that'll be able to hit the ground running when they get to their first jobs. And so again, in some cases, there is pretty good alignment between the assignment and the competency score. In other cases, not so much, but I think that's our challenge as educators.
Thanks, Forrest. Well, we're right now at 2 minutes before the end of the hour, and I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Forrest and Quint, are there any concluding comments that you'd like to add to the session?
Yeah, and looking at the competencies, I would really look and encourage you to add being able to teach and develop others as a key competency. Because one thing I've realized with all the new people in healthcare leadership, most of your graduates are going to be supervising people that aren't going to have the advantage of the academic rigor that you've given your students. So I think assessing and developing and teaching is going to be really, really vital on how to bring people along, because that's, as you know, you're all in it. So I think providing, when people walk out, the clear knowledge that they're a development of talent and how to go about doing that is going to be a real important competency.
Thanks, Quint. We are all teachers, right? Forrest?
Yeah. And the last thing I would say is I do have a graphic that we'll share in the slide of a tunnel and the light at the end of the tunnel. And the image that I really want to give, and the encouragement I want to give you all, is that the assessment piece is hard. It is really hard work, and all of you are struggling with it and are at different places with it. But really, my hope with this session was to say, okay, if we get this right, if we can actually make progress on the assessment side, the tremendous value that it has on precision leadership development, that is where the value comes in. And so again, I want to leave everybody with the hope is the struggle is real. but the struggle has value. There's reason why we're doing this. It's not just to check the box from a competency perspective for accreditation. It is really to improve our programs and our students. And that's why I'm so excited about this tool and what value it can bring to our programs.
Well, Quint and Forrest, thank you again for doing this. I think this was phenomenal, again, representing the commitment both of you have to CAHME and to the greater profession.